The room was tense as Marcus Freeman, a black man in a wheelchair, walked into the elite banking meeting. He was no stranger to the weight of judgment, but today he was about to face a different kind of challenge. The racist remarks from Emily Wells, a senior banker, weren't just offensive, they were personal. Emily thought she could easily dismiss Marcus, but what happened next would leave her speechless. What happens when a disabled black man fights back against the system that tried to tear him down? You won't believe the twist that changed everything. Before we dive into the shocking turn of events, tell us where you're watching from. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more jaw-dropping stories like this. Trust me, you won't want to miss this one. It was a cold, overcast morning when Marcus Freeman made his way into the bustling city bank, his wheelchair humming softly across the marble floor. The air was thick with the scent of fresh coffee and papers, yet his presence seemed to stir an unease in the room. Despite his sharp suit and the crisp air of authority that followed him, there were eyes that darted nervously his way. Marcus was used to it by now. His disability didn't just affect his legs, it had always made him an object of scorn in a world that wasn't designed for him. He had built an empire from the ground up, an empire that gave him a stronghold in the banking industry. His company, Freeman Enterprises, had funded countless successful ventures over the years, yet Marcus, the CEO, often felt invisible in the very industry he had conquered. Today he was meeting with Emily Wells, a senior banker, who had become the face of the institution. Marcus had known her for years, but this would be the first time they'd met on official grounds, and he'd never been one to shy away from the limelight. As he wheeled himself up to the front desk, Emily's eyes briefly flicked to him, her gaze lingering a fraction longer than necessary. It was hard not to notice her raised brow, as if she didn't quite expect a disabled man of color to be here to discuss business matters. It wasn't the first time, and it certainly wouldn't be the last. She smiled curtly. "Mr. Freeman, I've been expecting you." "Thank you," Marcus replied coolly, his voice carrying the weight of a man who had been underestimated his entire life. He gave her a nod, not missing the slight pause in her smile. She probably thought he didn't notice, but he had been trained to pick up on the smallest signs. He wasn't here for pleasantries or small talk, he had business to handle. As they made their way through the bank, Emily's stilted pace made it clear she wasn't entirely comfortable with Marcus's presence. The tension between them wasn't unfamiliar, but today felt different. The air was charged with something else, disdain. After a few minutes of exchanging pleasantries, Emily led him to a large meeting room. As they entered, Marcus noticed the disarray of paperwork, though he could see that Emily was trying to maintain a facade of professionalism. She gestured for him to sit, but as Marcus began to adjust himself into a seat, Emily's voice cut through the air. "You know, it's rare for someone like you to be involved in these kinds of deals," she remarked, not even trying to hide the condescension in her tone. "I wasn't sure if you had the kind of background for this. No offense, of course." Marcus was taken aback for a split second. The coldness in her voice was unmistakable, and in that moment, all the years of discrimination he had faced came rushing back. His fingers clenched against the armrests of his wheelchair. He had heard this kind of dismissiveness his entire life, never quite good enough, never quite belonging. But he wasn't here to fight old battles, he was here to win. "What do you mean by someone like me?" Marcus asked evenly, his voice calm but heavy with intent. He wasn't one to take insults lying down, but he also knew how to use people's prejudices to his advantage. "You think because I'm a disabled black man that I'm not capable of handling these deals?" Emily paused, her hand faltering over the papers in front of her. It wasn't just surprise that flashed across her face, but something deeper. A kind of discomfort that Marcus had learned to recognize in people like her. It was the kind of discomfort that came from confronting an inequality that couldn't be ignored. But she quickly composed herself, offering a thin smile. "I didn't mean it like that. I just wasn't aware that you were familiar with the intricacies of corporate banking. We have a very high standard for our clients, Mr. Freeman." Her words stung, but Marcus kept his gaze steady. He had worked too hard, for too long, to let the ignorance of a banker get under his skin. "Let me make something clear, Emily," Marcus began, leaning forward slightly, his hands resting on the edge of the table. "I know this business better than anyone in this room, and if you think for 1 second that my disability defines my abilities, you're about to be very surprised. Now let's get down to business." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of his life's work. Emily's eyes darted to the papers in front of her, a nervous flicker of uncertainty creeping into her expression. She wasn't used to people like Marcus challenging her so directly. Men like him weren't supposed to speak to her in such a way. She cleared her throat. "Of course, Mr. Freeman, let's proceed." Marcus sat back in his chair, the look of challenge still visible in his eyes. He wasn't just fighting for this deal. He was fighting against the years of prejudice and underestimation that had followed him. He could feel the shift in the room, a tension growing in the air. This was no longer just a business meeting. It was a test of power, pride, and the kind of strength that people like Emily often overlooked. As Marcus began to outline the details of the deal, Emily's attention seemed to waver. She glanced at the papers, then back at him, but her gaze was distracted, almost dismissive. It was clear to Marcus that she was trying to process the dissonance between the man in front of her and the preconceived notion she had about him. It wasn't long before he caught her gaze wandering to the side, where her colleague was standing by the door, waiting for her attention. Emily's attitude was as cold as ever, but Marcus could tell something was eating away at her. She didn't expect him to fight back. She didn't expect him to push back against the invisible barriers people like her had built around him. With a sudden clarity, Marcus knew this was more than just business. It was a moment of reckoning, for him and for her. The tension in the room grew palpable as Emily flipped through the documents in front of her. Marcus could tell she was trying her hardest to appear composed, but her discomfort was starting to show. He had been in enough rooms like this to know that when people felt threatened, they acted out of insecurity. It was the same dynamic every time. "So you're saying you're prepared to take on a deal like this?" Emily finally asked, her voice barely masking the skepticism. "Yes," Marcus replied, his tone unwavering. "I'm prepared. I've been preparing for this moment for years. I didn't just wake up and decide to walk in here and expect to be taken seriously. I've built an empire." "What have you built, Emily?" She faltered at the question. It wasn't just a challenge to her abilities. It was a challenge to her perception of him. He could see her trying to process the audacity of what he was saying, as though a man like him had no right to confront her with such confidence. The silence lingered for a moment, but Marcus didn't break his gaze. He wasn't there to win her approval. He was there to show her that despite everything she had assumed about him, he was just as capable, if not more, than anyone she had ever worked with. She cleared her throat again. "It's just that most of our clients are seasoned professionals, people who are already established in this industry. And I'm not?" Marcus asked, his voice laced with sharpness now. "Let me remind you that I didn't just buy my way into the game. I earned it, every single inch." Emily didn't respond immediately. She couldn't. The weight of his words hung heavily in the air. The shift in the room was undeniable, and she could feel the cracks in her own arrogance start to widen. But she wasn't ready to admit defeat. Not just yet. There was still the matter of her pride to protect. She turned her gaze back to the papers, flipping through them more hurriedly now, as if the action would give her some semblance of control. But Marcus could see the way her hands trembled. It wasn't just the business she was worried about. It was something deeper, something about him that unsettled her. "I just don't know if this is a good idea," Emily muttered, her voice betraying her once confident demeanor. "You're asking for a lot of capital. We don't usually approve this kind of loan to individuals who don't meet our usual standards." Marcus leaned forward slightly, the fire in his eyes now unmistakable. He had heard this argument countless times before. The discrimination, the hesitation, the doubt. It had always been the same with people like Emily, people who looked at him and saw nothing but his skin color, his disability, his difference. "I don't care about your standards," Marcus said, his voice steady, every word cutting through the room like a knife. "What you need to understand, Emily, is that your bank doesn't make the rules for people like me. I've had to fight my entire life to get to this point. Your standards don't apply to me, and you've already wasted enough of my time." For the first time since their meeting began, Emily paused, her expression faltering as she looked at him. The discomfort on her face was plain to see, and it wasn't just from the words he had spoken. It was from the weight of the realization that Marcus was no longer the person she thought he was. He was more, much more. The room fell silent again, and Marcus could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning and the rustling of papers. Emily seemed to be lost in thought for a moment, struggling to regain her composure. But Marcus wasn't done. He wasn't here to let her off easy. "You want to know why I'm in this chair, Emily?" Marcus continued, his gaze never leaving hers. "It's because people like you don't believe in people like me. You think I don't have the skills, the knowledge, or the experience, but I'm not here to prove that to you. I'm here to prove it to myself, and to everyone else who thinks they can stand in my way." Emily flinched at his words. The quiet tension that had filled the room began to shift, and for the first time she seemed to question everything she had believed about him. Marcus wasn't just any man. He wasn't just any disabled black man. He was a force to be reckoned with, a man who had fought for everything he had achieved and would fight for what was still to come. Emily glanced at the papers once more, but this time she didn't seem so sure. Her fingers lingered over the contract, her mind elsewhere. Marcus could see her processing, analyzing, and realizing that maybe, just maybe, She had misjudged him from the very start. Finally, she spoke, her voice quieter now, but still firm. "I think I need to consult with my colleagues before we move forward." "Of course," Marcus said smoothly, a small smirk playing at the corners of his lips. "But just remember, Emily, you can't consult your way out of this one. You've already made your decision. The question now is whether you'll stand by it or face the truth." There was a long pause as Emily stared at the papers in front of her, her hands trembling slightly. Marcus watched her carefully, his eyes never leaving her face. The tension in the room had shifted, but he wasn't done yet, not by a long shot. As the hours passed, the mood in the bank had become increasingly strained. Marcus Freeman had left the meeting room with a sense of quiet resolve, but something had shifted within Emily. For the first time, she was questioning not just Marcus, but her own beliefs about the world, her place in it, and how easily she had judged him. She had spent so many years in her ivory tower judging, dismissing, and making assumptions about others, and now it felt like the weight of her ignorance was coming crashing down. The initial arrogance she had felt upon meeting Marcus had faded. Now, in the aftermath of their exchange, Emily was left with a gnawing discomfort. She stared at the papers in front of her, unsure of what to do next. The deal was risky, yes, but what was even riskier was her own lack of vision. She had heard about Marcus Freeman for years, of course. He was a well-known figure in the financial world, but her thoughts about him had always been clouded by stereotypes. She had thought his disability and his race would somehow hold him back, but she was wrong, so utterly wrong. As the afternoon stretched on, Emily found herself thinking more and more about Marcus's words. She had heard him talk about how he had earned his success, how every step he took had been fought for, every inch gained through hard work and perseverance, and she couldn't shake the feeling that his success was the result of a grit and determination she couldn't fully understand. After a few minutes, Emily stood up abruptly. She needed answers. She needed to confront her own biases and the truth Marcus had made so painfully clear. She walked toward the door, determined to make things right. But as she passed through the hallway of the bank, she ran into one of her colleagues, David, a senior officer at the bank. "Hey, Emily," David said, smiling as he approached her. "How's the meeting with Marcus going?" Emily's expression softened, but the weight of the day's events hung heavily on her shoulders. "I'm still processing things. It didn't go as I expected," she admitted, her voice quieter than usual. David raised an eyebrow, sensing the shift in her demeanor. "What do you mean? I thought you were all set to approve his request for the loan." Emily sighed and leaned against the wall. She didn't know how to explain it, not without revealing how much of her own prejudice had come to light during the meeting. How could she admit that she had misjudged Marcus Freeman so completely, that she had been blind to the reality of his success and accomplishments? "It's just, I've been thinking a lot about Marcus," Emily said slowly, choosing her words carefully, "about how I treated him, the assumptions I made. And now, I don't know what to think." David's smile faded. "Look, I get it. He's got a reputation, sure, but he's a businessman, right? So what if he's a bit—" David caught himself, noticing the change in Emily's face. "Wait, you're not seriously thinking about letting him get away with this, are you?" Emily looked at him, her eyes narrowing slightly. "What do you mean? You're not going to give him the loan, are you? A guy like that? The risk is too high. Do we really want to throw the bank's reputation on the line for some—" David stopped mid-sentence, noticing the anger in Emily's eyes. It was the same reaction she had always received from the others in the bank. The skepticism, the doubt, the belief that Marcus Freeman, because of his race and disability, wasn't worthy of the trust they had placed in other clients. Emily's patience snapped. "I think you should reconsider your words, David. You don't know him like I do. He's earned everything he has. And maybe you don't realize it, but your thinking is outdated. We need to start recognizing real talent, real effort, not just who we think deserves a chance based on outdated standards." David stepped back, visibly taken aback. He hadn't expected this from Emily, the woman he had worked alongside for years, the one who always followed the rules, who always played it safe, was now standing up for someone she had once dismissed. She wasn't the same woman anymore. There was a fire in her eyes now that hadn't been there before. "I'm just saying," David muttered, his voice quieter now, "if you approve that loan, it's going to raise some eyebrows." Emily, with a determined expression, turned toward him, her gaze unwavering. "Let them raise their eyebrows. I'm going to do what's right." Back in his office, Marcus Freeman was waiting for the final decision. He had walked out of that meeting, but not because he was defeated. He had expected the pushback. He knew Emily would have doubts, and he understood it. People like him were always fighting uphill battles, constantly being told that they couldn't belong in spaces where others thought they didn't fit. But Marcus knew better. The door to his office creaked open, and in walked Emily, her face tense but resolute. She didn't hesitate as she walked up to Marcus's desk and placed the papers down in front of him. "Mr. Freeman," she began, her voice steady, "I've thought a lot about our conversation, and I've made my decision." Marcus didn't say a word, just looked up at her, waiting. "I'm approving your loan request," Emily continued, her words clear and firm. "I was wrong to judge you. I can see now that you're more than just a businessman. You're someone who's earned your place, and I'm going to make sure you get the funding you need to continue your success." The words were like music to Marcus's ears. He hadn't expected it, but he had hoped for it. Emily had changed. She had crossed the threshold of self-awareness and admitted that her biases had clouded her judgment. He stood up, offering a hand to shake. "Thank you, Emily. I appreciate this more than you know." Emily shook his hand, a genuine smile crossing her face for the first time that day. "No, Marcus, thank you for teaching me the true meaning of real success." The approval of Marcus Freeman's loan marked a turning point, not just in the paperwork of the bank, but in the minds of everyone involved. Word quickly spread among the employees of the bank that Emily Wells, who had once doubted Marcus's worth, had now backed his loan without hesitation. For some, it was an act of bravery. For others, it was a sign that Emily had broken free from the limitations of her own prejudices. But for Marcus, it was a small victory in the larger battle he had been fighting all his life. As the days passed, the tension between Marcus and the bank's higher-ups started to settle. The decision had been made, and the deal was progressing smoothly. But even as he received confirmation of his loan approval, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was at play here, something more than just a financial transaction. Emily's change of heart had triggered something in him that went deeper than just business. Emily, for her part, felt like a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. She had never imagined she would be personally responsible for challenging the systemic prejudices she had unknowingly harbored. But it wasn't just the loan approval that weighed on her mind. It was the question of whether she could truly undo the damage of her past actions. Could one moment of clarity be enough to make up for the years of subtle biases she had carried? For the first time in her career, Emily wasn't just another banker. She was now part of something more significant. She was part of the shift that was starting to take place in the way people, especially those like Marcus Freeman, were seen in spaces that had traditionally been closed off to them. As Marcus drove through the city streets that evening, his mind was a mix of emotions: satisfaction, relief, and an ever-growing determination. He had come so far to get to this point, but this was just the beginning. The loan wasn't the final victory. It was just a stepping stone, another battle won in his war against a system designed to keep people like him at the bottom. He couldn't afford to celebrate just yet. His phone buzzed on the passenger seat. It was a message from Tina, one of the senior associates at Freeman Enterprises. She had been a close ally and confidant throughout his journey, and her message was short, but it carried weight. "You did it, Marcus. Everyone is talking about you. This is just the beginning." Marcus smiled to himself as he read the message. Tina had always believed in him, even when others doubted. But it was that doubt, that relentless belief that he wasn't good enough, that had pushed him to achieve even more than he thought possible. As he made his way to the office, he thought back to the moment with Emily. He had never intended for her to change her mind so suddenly. It wasn't just about the loan approval. It was about what had happened in that room. The truth was clear. He was more than his disability, more than the race that others often saw first. He was a force to be reckoned with, and now, so was his company. Back at the bank, Emily sat in her office, staring out of the window at the skyline. The day's events had left her in a contemplative mood. She couldn't stop thinking about how Marcus had made her face the biases that had held her back for so long. She thought about their conversations, how he had called her out on her assumptions, and how he had responded with nothing but strength and dignity. Emily had spent years in the financial world, believing that she could measure a person's worth by the amount of money they had, or the titles they held. But Marcus had shattered that illusion in one simple meeting. Her phone buzzed again. It was a message from her supervisor, Charles, who had been following up on the loan. The message was brief but to the point. "The board is asking questions. We need to justify the approval. Prepare the report on the loan. Make sure you cover everything." Emily sighed, rubbing her temples. She wasn't just preparing a report for the board. She was preparing to explain to everyone at the bank why she had done the unthinkable: approve the loan of a disabled black man. It wasn't just a business decision anymore. It had become a statement, and now the bank's entire reputation was on the line. As the pressure mounted, Emily couldn't help but think back to the way Marcus had handled himself. His grace, his unwavering confidence. He had stood there, not asking for anyone's approval, but taking what he knew was rightfully his. He had demanded respect, and in doing so he had earned it. With a deep breath, Emily began typing out the report. As she worked, she couldn't shake the nagging question that had been on her mind since Marcus left her office. Had she done the right thing? Was she merely trying to appease her conscience, or had she truly seen something in Marcus that others had missed? The doubt, just like before, crept back in. Meanwhile, Marcus was sitting at his desk, preparing for a meeting with his team, but his mind wasn't on business. It was still on the interaction with Emily. He had been able to handle the situation with grace, but what was the cost? Had he really won, or had he just proved the system's cruelty by succeeding in a world designed to keep people like him out? He received another message, this time from the board at Freeman Enterprises. It was a confirmation of the loan, but it also included an invitation. Marcus, we'd like you to speak at the upcoming financial summit. We believe it's time the world hears your story. The message felt like a victory, but Marcus didn't let the excitement show. It wasn't about the stage or the spotlight. It was about the message he could send. His voice, his story, could inspire others like him to rise above their challenges and demand a seat at the table. As Marcus prepared to respond, he felt the weight of his responsibility settle over him once more. This wasn't just about a loan. It was about changing perceptions, breaking barriers, and proving that people like him had just as much a right to succeed as anyone else. The day of the financial summit had arrived, and Marcus Freeman stood backstage, adjusting his suit jacket. The conference hall was buzzing with excitement as industry leaders and top financial professionals gathered to hear from the key speakers. Marcus was one of them now, and it was a position he had never imagined, not when he first started out. This moment had been years in the making, and now it was time to take center stage. But as he stood backstage, he couldn't help but think about everything that had led to this point. The years of doubt, the discrimination he had faced, the constant battle to prove himself in an industry that didn't seem to want him. But here he was, about to speak to the very people who had once doubted him. In the crowd, Emily Wells sat among the audience, her eyes on Marcus. She had been invited to the summit as well, not as a speaker, but as an attendee. Her heart raced as she thought about everything that had transpired, the loan approval, the moments of realization that had turned her world upside down. She had seen Marcus as a businessman, but now, as she watched him preparing to speak, she saw him as much more. He was the embodiment of the resilience she had never understood until now. When Marcus's name was called, the room fell silent. The anticipation was thick in the air as Marcus stepped onto the stage, the lights blinding for a moment before his eyes adjusted. He looked out over the sea of people, all expecting him to speak about business, about numbers, profits, and deals. But Marcus wasn't there to talk about those things. He stepped up to the podium, his hands resting on it with quiet confidence. The murmurs of the crowd quieted as his voice broke through the silence. "Good morning," he began, his voice steady and powerful. "I'm Marcus Freeman, and I've been in this industry long enough to know that you have to fight for every inch of progress. I've seen how people like me, black people, disabled people, are pushed aside. We're told we don't belong here, that we're not fit for the seat at the table." There was a collective shift in the room. People were listening. Now some of you may wonder why I'm here, why I'm speaking to you of all people about my journey. The truth is simple, because I had to fight for every step I took, for every opportunity I earned, and for every respectable position I've reached. I've seen the barriers, I've faced the doubts, but instead of letting them break me, I used them to fuel my determination. Marcus's eyes scanned the crowd, meeting the eyes of several executives and industry leaders. I've been underestimated because of my disability, my race, and even my background. But here's the truth. Those things don't define me. They never did. A murmur of approval spread through the crowd. Marcus paused, allowing the gravity of his words to settle before continuing. "I'm not the exception. I'm the rule," Marcus said, his tone unwavering. "People like me, who have been told time and again that we can't succeed, are rising, and we're not doing it to prove others wrong. We're doing it to prove ourselves right. We have the strength, the vision, and the resilience to break through the walls you've built." The room was silent now, everyone hanging on his every word. Emily sat at the edge of her seat, her heart pounding as she realized that Marcus wasn't just speaking for himself. He was speaking for everyone who had been silenced by the world. He was speaking for those who had been marginalized for too long. "I didn't come here to be celebrated or praised," Marcus continued. "I came here to demand a seat at the table, just like everyone else. Because if we want to change the system, we can't keep allowing it to remain the same. It's time for a new kind of leadership, one that values people, not their appearances, one that recognizes potential, not preconceived notions." The audience was now completely captivated, and Marcus could see that his words were having an impact. He had their attention, he had their respect. "As I stand here today, I can tell you this much," Marcus concluded, his voice steady and powerful. "I'm just getting started. The world will see what people like me can do, and when we rise, we bring everyone with us." The room erupted into applause, a standing ovation that echoed through the hall. Marcus stood tall, his chest swelling with pride. He had done it, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been told they couldn't succeed because of their race, their disability, or any other factor. As the applause died down, Marcus stepped away from the podium, a sense of peace settling over him. He had finally proven that nothing could stand in his way. But as he made his way off the stage, he glanced to his side and saw Emily standing at the edge of the room, her eyes filled with awe and respect. For the first time since their meeting, she smiled at him, not out of apology, but out of genuine admiration. The moment was silent, but to Marcus it spoke volumes. He had earned not just Emily's respect, but the respect of everyone in that room. It was a victory in the truest sense of the word.